Hey there, I'm Tracy Rigdon, and this is the Contrast Project Lounge podcast. Often random, but always relevant, always real, and practically nothing is off limits. This podcast is for you. Are you ready for this? Let's do it. Welcome back to the program, guys, and thank you so much for joining us for another edition of Wednesday Night Live of the Contrast Project Lounge podcast. Tonight, we have my good friend, Dr. Tim Gilmore, is going to be talking about Southern Gothic, something that he has coined the phrase over and over. And with my co-hosts, Mr. Jim Alabiso and Charles Gaskins. Guys, how are you doing tonight?
Cheers, mates.
Pretty killer. Yeah.
Doing well, Tracy. Glad to be here.
I know. Hey, Tim, let's talk about something that actually, I don't know if anybody knows this, but you have been on this program, I think, more than anybody else.
You're kidding, really?
Wow. You appeared in our studio when we started way back in the day, and you've been on. That's right. So one of the things that we had talked about was psychogeography.
Mm-hmm.
A phrase that, you have coined over the years and you talk about. So tell us exactly what psychogeography is.
Yeah, well, it's kind of hard to say exactly what it is, but it's a phrase that probably started with a French philosopher named Guy Debord, but in the 60s, and has been used in a number of ways over the years for anything in the arts and and literature that has to do with exploring place. Psychogeography is a portmanteau word, the psychology of geography, kind of like the spirit of place.
Mm-hmm.
Writers like Ian Sinclair, who is this British writer who writes 1,000-page books about walking the entire periphery of London and everything that he sees there. He's absolutely hardcore psychogeography, but also other writers. There's a British writer named Peter Ackroyd, who's one of my favorite novelists, but he also writes a lot of nonfiction. Thinking about that kind of urban exploration. And it doesn't have to be urban, but it usually is. People have also kind of looked backward and thought of Walt Whitman and Charles Baudelaire and even Edgar Allan Poe as psychogeographers. It's really about thinking about place and the effects that place has on people.
Mm-hmm.
And looking even at patterns of story in place, And so for me, it's a way to look at this weird hometown of mine and try and make some sense of it, street corner by street corner,
Right.
There's a guy I know that lives in Cheltenham. His name is Quentin, and he basically hiked around the whole island of the United Kingdom.
Mm.
And he's a photographer too, so he blogged and wrote and photographed his way. It's over 385 days around the island. He's got a book called Perimeter coming out here really soon. So he lives in England. I'm looking forward to seeing that.
That's amazing. Tim, as you're approaching somewhere in the neighborhood of about 800 stories on Jack's Psychogeo website.
Getting there, yeah.
What themes do you see? Yeah, what themes do you see repeating themselves? Across time and space. As it pertains to North Florida or the overall narrative.
A number of them. If two people who have lived in Jacksonville for a while or know the city or know the region, wouldn't be enormous surprises, but things that have to do with race and religion, things that have to do with, Jacksonville is a strange kind of border region too, but people have called it the capital of South Georgia, right? People used to say that
I've never heard that, but that's great.
Well, interestingly, in the late 1800s and into the 90s, Jacksonville was, had a lot of people who were born in the Northeast here. And in fact, during the Civil War and before the Civil War, most of Jacksonville supported the United States side, not the Confederate States side. But then about 1915, there are more people at that point who were born in Georgia than who were born in Jacksonville. And really that starts to shape the psychology of the city. Harry Crews, great Southern Gothic novelist and short story writer, said that he was born in Southwest Georgia, and he said that Jacksonville is a place where Georgia goes when the crops fail. And I think a lot of that,
Okay.
and that was his experience, that whenever times got too hard growing up in rural Georgia, everybody headed down to Jacksonville and worked in the Swisher cigar factory.
My father worked there.
Say,
Yeah.
and the Swisher was one of my dad's clients back in the day before he
Yeah.
passed. Yeah,
Swisher is connected to just about everything if you go back far enough.
big time.
Yeah, yeah. So
Wow.
really, I think it's a far more interesting area than I understood growing up here. When I grew up, everybody that I knew wanted to get out of town. And Jacksonville had a brain drain problem. And I think that for a number of years now, I've seen younger people have kind of an easier time finding their tribe, so to speak, than I did, back in the late 80s and the early 90s.
Do you think, Tim, the brain drain's reversed itself now a bit?
In some ways, yeah, in some ways. But, the last few years, Florida itself has managed to drive a lot of people out, right?
Sure.
With everything that has gone on here culturally in the last several years.
Yeah.
And, interestingly, when I was growing up, people kind of looked at Jacksonville as this most backward big city in Florida. And
Right.
over the years, it seems like people have stopped seeing Jacksonville as exceptional in any way like that and just started kind of like looking at all of Florida the way people used to look at Jacksonville, where it's just this bizarre. I mean, anywhere, Stephen Colbert or somebody has something on about Florida, it's
Yeah.
alligators
Exactly.
and meth
Yeah.
or something.
Alligators and meth, exactly. Yes.
Alligators and meth. Yeah. Title of my next book.
And pub subs.
When I first got here, Tim, I think I got here, and I didn't grow up here. I moved here right my senior year of high school. I went to Orange Park High School, and Blanding was just 2 lanes with a line going down the middle of it, and Moody Road was dirt road, and we were surrounded by cow pastures, and Orange Park Mall was a cow pasture and all that. But it's like it really has evolved. I think and now I love living here.
Well, I think one of the things that is necessary for any city to really have a cohesive sense of identity and culture is for its urban core to have enough community and density in it. And it used to be that, Springfield didn't really have that. And even parts of Riverside didn't really have that. I think it's easy if you've been here for a while, at least, to look at the empty spaces downtown and take for granted that there actually has been a lot of movement into the urban core, and including downtown, although it needs to, go a long way still. But, I teach at FSCJ out at South Campus, and I think most of my students, even if they've never really been far from Kernan Boulevard, they know about Riverside, So it has
people cross the ditches to come here.
Yeah, so it has I think more of a community and cultural cohesion than it used to, and hopefully that will only keep getting stronger.
Well,
Tracy, can I go off script for 1 second? Because I wanted to ask Tim.
Yeah.
I really always wanted to ask you this anyway, because you're so prolific. I just wanted to ask you about process. I mean, we keep talking about, he's written a zillion books and all the ones that are behind. And
those are not all mine.
I know. But, could you tell us about process? Because, like, we talk to musicians on the show or artists on the show. We always talk about process and really like to understand, how can you just churn out so many words, and how do you find that discipline?
Yeah. Well, it's changed some over the years. And honestly, it's, I always find this an interesting thing to talk about different writers' processes. And,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of people want to be writers for some reason. They have some kind of, I don't know, romantic notion of what it means to be a writer, but they don't want to write, really, I mean, I think about the way William Wordsworth defined poetry. He called it the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling recollected in tranquility. So it's almost this kind of contradictory thing. He calls it a spontaneous overflow, but then he says it's recollected later. And I think that a lot of people want to rely solely on inspiration, but you have to constantly, I think, just keep pushing and keep, it's a lot of hard work. So I used to write mostly at night, and my kids were still at home, and I was teaching during the daytime, and it seemed like the only time I could really get to where I could focus was at night. And I would stay up back then until 2 a.m. writing sometimes. Now I sometimes write at night, but I'm best writing in the mornings if I can. And that depends on my teaching schedule and everything too. But I try to, one of the things that keeps me, that guides me, is that I try to do a story week for Jack Psychogeo, and that those stories often connect to other projects. And I'm always kind of waiting for a subject to tell me that it needs more time, it needs more space, and those are the subjects that end up becoming book projects or play projects. So it's mostly, I think, about just being consistent and constant.
And do you edit your own stuff?
I edit just endlessly. I mean, I talk to my students about this.
Endlessly.
Well, I mean, really, a piece of writing is never done. You at some point have to finish what you're doing with it if you're going to put it out in the world. But I think any writer sees things that they've done in previous years, and hopefully they've grown since then, and they go, oh my God, why did I word it that way? Or why did I do this like that? Right. And maybe any kind of artist, I'm sure, does that.
Yeah.
But, I do have to say that my poor wife and best friend has read just about everything, not everything, but just about everything that I've put out there. And she's honest and merciless, and I need
and that's good.
And that's good. But yeah, even with, Jack Psychogeo stories, by the time I talk to my students about revision, and it's hard to get students to, if they don't have to, even read what they've written, much less revise something once. With a Jack Psychogeo story, I mean, I have probably revised it 40 or 50 times before I finally put it out, and still, sometimes I'll get an email and say, hey, you left out, a word here or something.
So is this a flow of, when you're like actually writing, is this a flow of consciousness thing, or are you editing as you write?
I'm editing as I write. But I know that some people, a friend of mine, Saurabh Frisis, who is, a wonderful writer, he is very much of the mind that what you are putting down to begin with, you put it down in the best form you can put it down. And other people say, you know what, just get it going and get it out there and then come back and rework it. I think I'm somewhere in between, I do want to get some kind of flow going, and there is a weird way in which the critical can kind of get in the way of the creative, and block you up. But I think it's never really one process or the other. It's always this kind of back and forth.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, Tim, let me ask you about your most recent work, the story of Willie Brown.
Yeah.
And why did his connection to nature feel like, a spiritual tether to Jacksonville, and in the way that you wrote it?
Yeah, thank you. So that's it's my most recent book, The Wilderness and Willie Brown. And his story is that he lived off of near St. John's Bluff in this incredible space, hundreds of acres, and those acres comprise actually several different ecosystems. And he kept to himself, and he always lived in this one-room cabin that he had built with his brother, who died a good bit before him. He never had electricity or running water or a phone, but weirdly, he had this kind of magnetism. I mean, he kept to himself, but people knew him and they came out to see him. He, even when he was alive, was he had a big effect on artists and writers and environmentalists and conservationists. He died in 1970, so this is right after. There's kind of this shift towards an ecological consciousness in the country. And when he dies in 1970, he leaves all of his acres to the Nature Conservancy. He wants them to be preserved forever because he feels like people need this kind of connection to nature, and it's going to be harder and harder for people to have that connection. So eventually, those acres become what's now the Theodore Roosevelt area, which is part of the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve, which is owned by the National Park Service and has wonderful hiking trails, including, Willie Brown trails. Willie Brown's strange face is on signage out there. He looks like he walked out of a Flannery O'Connor novel or something.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, he didn't believe in taking anything more than he needed, and so he was skeletal. He was pencil thin all of his life. He didn't believe in drinking sodas or anything, and most of what he lived off of he got from the land around him. And so it's been all of these years since he died, but he still has this enormous effect on people. Mark Woods suggested, and the Florida Times-Union, that we should have a Willie Brown Day. He suggested that a few years ago. And writing the book, not only did I research his life and talk to people who remembered him, but, I included artwork by people like Jim Draper and Kathy Stark and several other people who have been profoundly affected by the idea of Willie Brown.
How were you affected by Willie Brown, being so immersed in Willie Brown while you were writing it?
It's really interesting. Whenever I'm writing a larger project that centers on a person that way, I always kind of feel like I'm trying to get to know that person. And, people always thought of him almost synonymously with his land. And people would go hiking out there, and he always seemed to know if somebody was somewhere on his acres. I found, well, I didn't find that the Park Service has them, but I went through all of these old letters that his father had written. His father was a lawyer who was actually born in New York State, in Brooklyn. And although you couldn't really tell from reading his letters because he had zero punctuation and he misspelled everything. And I was like, this guy's a lawyer. But he stayed in the city a lot. He stayed in Jacksonville, and he's writing letters back to Willie and his brother Saxon, who were staying by themselves when they're teenagers on this land with, these bluffs overlooking the marsh and everything. And he's writing them, and telling them, don't burn too much oil, don't burn down another building.
Ah.
Yeah, there's all of these. He's telling them, one of my favorites is that their mother, who also lives in the city, is going to come visit them soon. And, he says, you need to stop making such a mess with the chicken feed and get rid of the rats. And he says, get rid of the rats, your mother's coming. And, Willie Brown has this kind of, people think of him as this kind of, this person who's emblematic of conservation. And they think of him as, I don't know, this kind of iconic figure. But he was messy. I mean, he had streetcars out there by his house. I don't know how, nobody knows how they got out there. He had one of them was full of old books.
Paul Bunyan just grabbed it for him.
What's that?
Sorry. I said Paul Bunyan grabbed him for him.
Yeah, maybe.
He sounds like a mythological being,
Yeah.
you know?
Absolutely. But he's just the more you get to know anybody, you pull apart those kinds of complications and contradictions, and I think that a lot of times that's what makes.
Well,
you know
what, Tim, I'm gonna shift gears here just a little bit. Another story that you covered that I was very familiar with because I actually spent a lot of time out in that area when I was growing up. The Mayport Monster.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it was more than just true crime.
This is where you met the.
I met
stepdaughter.
Yeah. So there's actually two stories. One of them was at the end of last year, and that was on William Wells. His name's Billy Wells. And he's actually the one who named himself the Mayport Monster, and the media kind of went along with it. So, but what happened, and this is the early 2000s, was that he killed 5 people in his trailer that was right there actually across from the restaurant that his mother-in-law and father-in-law ran. It was called Bill and Angie's Seafood. Before that, they had a place called the Damnifino, which was all kind of the way it was written was all like it was one word. And so trailer's right across the street from their restaurant. He killed 5 people inside over a period of 11 days. And he's just inside with his son, who didn't know anything about it. Although by that point, bodies are starting to smell.
11 days.
His son is, he's a little boy, and they're inside watching Disney movies, and he's ordering pizza and stuff. And so I went out to, Mayport to look around and see if I could find anybody to talk to who remembered it. It wasn't that long ago. And so I'm talking to this guy named Lewis Floyd, who he's a shrimper, and he's just sitting across the street from where the trailer used to be. The trailer's gone now. And so I'm talking to him, and he's telling me, yeah, actually, the woman that Billy Wells was married to, her name was Irene Wells. She went by Tootie, was her nickname. So everybody knew her as Tootie. Lewis was actually married to Tootie before Billy was. Lewis had two children with Tootie. So not the little boy that Billy Wells kept in the trailer with him the whole time, but another son who had also, this is just full of tragedy. I mean, these people's lives, even outside of this series of killings, their little boy had been run over by a semi right in front of the restaurant across the street. And and he's telling me all about Billy Wells, and he knew him all his life and everything. And then he tells me that in fact his stepdaughter had been inside the trailer with Billy while Billy was killing people as well.
Wow.
And I mentioned her just a bit, but of course, she was a kid at the time, so I'm not using. I didn't even use her name in the first story. And then, so I published that story, and it gets lots of attention. She contacts me. And, she said, she's now in her 30s. She has spent her life making herself hard to find. Can imagine,
Yeah.
She's never told anybody publicly her story before, but she felt like I didn't write it in a sensational way or anything sensational enough that certainly anybody who tried to do anything more sensational with it would just be shameful, right? But she ended up sharing her story with me, and I wrote that as the next story, which is just called Shauna's story. She's a caretaker now. She's been through lots of therapy in her life,
I guess.
I imagine so. Yeah.
She was there in the trailer. She was 11 at the time. She was there in the trailer when
Wow.
Billy Wells killed her mother, her uncle, and her grandfather. She did not know at the time that they were dead. He would put them in different rooms of the trailer and then tape the rooms off. And at some
How
point,
big was this trailer? Oh, wow.
yeah,
Sorry.
it's
Yeah, in a
I don't know
trailer.
the answer to that. It's not like the smallest. It's not like a regular small single wide trailer that you might usually picture. But yeah, I don't know. But so she's there for a while this is going on, and then Billy, the monster of Mayport, calls her father, who is this guy that I've been talking to, outside this convenience store across the street from where the trailer used to be. This guy, Lewis Floyd, and says, "Hey, come get your daughter." Don't know why he does that. And Lewis comes up to the trailer and takes Shauna, and Billy is left with just his son at that point inside the trailer. Later that night, Shauna tells me that Billy comes over to her father's trailer and knocks on the door and says the other of the little boy's nickname that he had kept in the trailer with him. His nickname's Froggy. All right. He knocks on the door and says Froggy's out in the truck and he wants to talk to Shauna. And they look out there. They don't see anybody else in the truck. And it also kind of looks like he's holding something behind his back. And Lewis says, she's not going out of the trailer tonight. And he turns around and leaves. I'm pretty sure it was a gun that he had behind his back. She came, really, really close, probably, to being another one of his victims.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
So she's had a lifetime of dealing with, inevitably survivor's guilt and wondering why she's still here.
Yeah.
But she's it's astounding that she has really made something positive of her life, and she, maybe because she has to be, is a remarkably positive person. And again, I think it's because she has to be. She's kind of
So many
Bring to the light from darkness.
so many stories. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
Jacksonville is just full of colorful stories. Tim, how do you separate myth from memory when it comes to writing about, the South and Jacksonville in particular? How do you separate myth from memory?
That's an interesting question. That's an interesting phrase, myth from memory. I think
just false memory too. Yeah.
Sure, right. Well, one thing that makes me think of is that, when I'm writing, I'm trying to get to whatever the truth is, of course. I'm interested in the things people are telling me that that aren't necessarily true also. And I'm interested in how people's stories conflict with each other. And I actually like to, in my writing, I like to include those stories, not as true, but I like to include them because I think stories contain us instead of the other way around. A lot of times stories take on lives of their own.
Sure.
People, for example, it's been 10 years since I wrote a book about Otis Toole, who, depending on who you believe, is either one of the worst serial killers in history or never really killed anybody, but was a pathological liar. And
Right.
So I'm pretty sure that I know the answer to that. He had an IQ of about 75. He liked to set houses in Springfield on fire in the 70s and the early 1980s. And when his friend and lover Henry Lee Lucas was arrested for a couple of murders, Otis Toole started saying, "Oh yeah, I did that too, and that and that and that," and people. He fascinates me not because I think he killed all these people, because I don't think he did, but because here is somebody who had an IQ of about 75 and somebody that was just abused all of his life and picked on all of his life. But he had this power to figure out the kinds of stories people wanted to hear and embellish and embellish and embellish, and people ate them up to the point that he ended up saying that he was a cannibal, and he had special barbecue sauce and recipes and things like that. And the thing is, there are all of these quite frankly, absurd stories about him. But those are the stories that most people believe.
Right.
And I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
People don't necessarily want the truth. They might think they do, but a lot of times
Yep.
they purposely choose fiction or on a larger scale. I think you've got individual stories, and then you've got legends, which are stories that have kind of taken on lives of their own in the community. And then on a larger scale from that, you've got myth, which has some kind of something that seems true to people, but doesn't necessarily have to have a direct basis in the truth. And people often choose myth over the stories that are sometimes most obviously true.
That happened to me in reverse.
Yeah.
When I did All the Angels Come, and the character that Mal Jones played, Willis, was inspired by Willis at the beach, right? Are you familiar with Willis?
Yeah.
At the beach.
I remember the play and I came to see it. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So I would see things on Facebook. People would go visit him at the beach and they'd post their visit and they'd talk about how hard a life he had. And they tell some of the story, but the story wasn't true. It was from All the Angels. I was like, what? No. That's fiction, y'all. But speaking about what we choose to believe and what's fact and what's real, this book, I had to ask you this. I didn't want this show to be over without talking about this a little bit.
Okay.
Because this is truth, right? And it's hard truth. And I just wanted to talk to you about, the impact that this had and how you felt about that.
Yeah. So I guess I should say.
I know to tell the audience, this went back about, 8 years ago you wrote this?
Well,
it's 2016, right?
2016, and so almost 10 years. But I've done some other stories that are contingent to it since then, and I've been working on a revision because I've talked to a lot more people. So for people who don't know what the book is, it has to do with one of the most prominent churches in our area, Trinity Baptist Church.
And I know, Tim, you and I have talked about this.
Yeah. And their affiliated school, Trinity Christian Academy.
Yeah.
And so first, let me just kind of say why it's important. And then if I could kind of back up and say what my personal connection to it is. What happened is that the church and the school covered up the fact that not its founding pastor, but the pastor who turned it into is actually one of Florida's first mega churches. It's actually got several different campuses now, but I don't think is even now quite as big as it was at its height. But the church and the school covered up the fact that this pastor, whose name was Bob Gray, sexually abused children there for about 50 years. They covered it up for about 50 years, and he wasn't the only one to abuse children there. The very last thing that I did in writing the book was to go and meet with the current pastor, and he's still the current pastor. His name is Tom Messer. I sat in his office with him. It's the office that it was Bob Gray's office too. Messer was directly involved in this deal that happened in the 1990s, where several families found out that some of their kids were victims. And when an organization like this can pretend that it's, that one victim is the only victim and it was a one-off and promise it'll never happen again, and don't throw away all the good things the church has done and don't harm Jesus in the process and everything else, then they can keep it quiet a lot of times. But when families start finding out that they're not alone and that there are other victims and there are other families, they start talking to each other, and then there's a big problem for the church. The church made this deal, met with these families, and said that they would take Gray out of the church, send him out of the country. They actually made him a missionary to Germany if all of these families would keep quiet about it. The families agreed. they kept quiet about it until Gray came back to the United States in 2006 when he's unhealthy and he's arrested. And all of these families came forward, and he actually died in jail awaiting trial. My personal connection to this is that I grew up in this very fundamentalist childhood. I'm whatever, something between, I don't know, atheist and an agnostic and a pantheist now, I guess. But, I'm a long way from my childhood. But my parents met at this church. And the thing that really messes with my head more than anything else is my mother's first husband was this incredibly abusive, horrible human being. But the fundamentalist beliefs on, women's agency and on whether or not you could get divorced, et cetera, meant that she actually had to get permission from Bob Gray himself in order to divorce her first husband and then to marry the man who would become my father. So the thing that I have to wonder is if, Bob Gray had never given my mother permission to divorce her first husband and then to marry my father, would I be here? And that's a
head trip.
It is. It really is.
Wow.
But the school, the church and the school, they're thriving right now. I see the last couple of years they have launched this huge PR campaign. They've got billboards up, they've got bumper stickers, they've got yard signs.
I live on the west side. And I routinely ride by there, so I see the place.
Yeah. So and since the book has come out, I've had lots of other people get in touch with me and tell me their stories.
I would imagine so.
There's a good bit more to add.
Well,
was that an unexpected reaction to when you first put it out? Did you expect people to come up forward?
I had talked to so many people already. I don't know to what extent I was thinking, that there would be a lot more people come forward. But at the same time, I know of one person who was abused who committed suicide before I ever started researching the book. So there's no way to ever really figure out how many victims there were. When I met with Tom Messer, he used the phrase 20 or 30 or 40 victims, or however many there were. And
holy shit.
When I talked to Dennis and Pat Cassell, Dennis was Trinity Christian Academy's first football coach. Dennis, by the way, so they had both moved away from the church and the school when all of this came to light. And Dennis, Trinity Christian Academy's first football coach, called it the perfect pedophile paradise. That's what he called it. Pat Cassell said she thought there were hundreds of victims, and that we'll never know how, it's impossible to measure.
Wow. Well, guys, I tell you what, I've had a wonderful discussion tonight. Tim, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your stories. Have you guys got anything to add before we take off?
Sure, I didn't want to.
I'd like to go ahead, Charles. Oh wait, sorry, Jim. Oh, okay.
You go ahead. Go ahead, Charles.
After all the darkness, just a quick little happy thing. Last year around this time, a woman I was dating, we were at a cafe, and a bookshelf in there, and so she's looking at it and she's like, "Oh, there's a lot of books written by the same guy. He probably lives here." And I walked over and I was like, "I've sent you links to his website. That's." Jack Psychogeography. She's like, "Oh, it's the same person." She just didn't put it together. So yeah.
And there is a lot of stuff there that is not doom and gloom. I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was adorable that she didn't put it together. And I was like, she's like, "Oh yeah, you sent me a bunch of articles from that website." Yeah. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to forget to mention the second Sundays, Tim. You want to tell the audience about that?
Sure.
I've been to a couple of these, so these are great.
Yeah. So real quickly, if I can, before I do, I just want to quickly mention that I'm right now fascinated by this artist who died in 1989 named Memphis Wood, who did, I wrote a Psychogeo story about her, and I think this is going to be my next book. Yeah, there she is. She was called, at one point, she was called Jacksonville's First Lady of Art. She was surprisingly radical in a number of ways and really only kind of came into her own after she retired from teaching at Landon High School. And my favorite of her works is in the Unitarian Universalist Church in Jacksonville off Arlington Expressway. It's 22 feet tall. It's a textile work, and it is like you are looking directly into some kind of mystic vision. It's absolutely gorgeous and astounding.
I liked how you wrote when you were writing about it, that it was relegated to the women's section.
Yep. Yeah, you can see that in the bottom corner and what you got up on the screen there. Yeah.
It's in the old T.
Yeah. Happy Medium is this great bookstore in Riverside at Park.
Wonderful.
Yeah. It's where there was a comic book store there for a number of years. That store, Happy Medium, is incredibly supportive of all kinds of literary and artistic things going on in the community. Their calendar is full like every week. And the second Sunday of every month is something that we call Second Sundays with Poets and Writers. It happens at 2:00, and we usually have two writers who read for 20 or 30 minutes or so, and then we've got some conversation afterwards. It's a light space. It's friendly and communal. And it's one of my favorite things going on in the city right now. So thanks for mentioning that, Jeff.
Yeah, it's great, and they also have music there. So. Right. So That's great. We have speakers and things like that. Plus, it's a great store. They have coffee. It's like a book. It's kind of like it's a bookstore coffee shop.
That's exactly right.
Right. And so it's kind of got a quiet vibe to it, you know?
Yeah, and you can't go wrong with that. You can't go wrong with that. Guys, thank you so much for being here this week. We'll see you next time.
Guys.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
The balloons or the confetti. Oh, that didn't work.
There you go.
Gotta do this.
See you guys.
I think you got to throw your arms up. Well, that's a wrap. Another fantastic episode of the podcast. You can find us on all the social media platforms, wherever you surf, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter X, Threads, wherever. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. And on our YouTube channel, don't forget to like, share, comment, and smash that subscribe button. If you're streaming audio for the podcast, you can find us wherever you get your favorite podcast programs. In the meantime, I like to tell everybody, take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time, peace.